Perfect. All right, so welcome everyone. So it's my distinct pleasure to welcome Dr. Rand Waltzman today for a talk. I have known Rand for a decade. In fact, he was actually the first program manager at DARPA I ever worked with in the DARPA's MISC program. And interestingly enough, both ISI and my former team at Indiana University were part of that program. So Rand was a program manager at DARPA for half a decade or so. Before that, he was a chief scientist at the Lockheed Martin ATL. And before that, he served as an associate professor at the Royal Institute of Technology in Sweden for almost two decades. And most recently, he was the CTO of the RAND Corporation nearby in Santa Monica. I think RAND, is fair to say, is one of the luminaries on the study of manipulation of online systems and in general social media and so on, and he has been shepherding the research agenda on deception and manipulation for a long time. So it's great to have him today to talk about this. So Rand, why don't you take it from here?
Okay. Well, so what I would like to do today is, this talk is not going to be extremely technical. I was told that it was going to be sort of open to everyone. So what I would like to do is sort of give you a tour through all the wonderful ways that artificial intelligence technologies, and not all of them, but a good number of ways that AI technology can be used to do really bad things to people. So we spend lots of time listening to all the great things AI technology can be used for. Well, today you're going to hear about the not so great things, particularly in the area of manipulation of people, which is where I came up with the name MADMAN, short for machine-driven manipulation. I like making up acronyms, of course. That's my DARPA training, I'm afraid. So yes, so to begin, let me kind of get this thing out of the way. There we go. Yeah, so really MADMAN, we're talking about, the integration of AI systems, AI technology into tools that are used to really manipulate target audiences, particularly in the information environment. And of course, one of the really great things about the information environment as a place to manipulate people is that there is so much data available about people that you can actually, today with the tools that are available, even commercial tools like even tools, as I'll discuss a little bit later, that even Facebook and Google and other people supply, you could do very precise targeting of your audience. And that's, in the old days, if you wanted to try to message people, well, you had to do survey. If you wanted to direct messages to them, you had to do surveys and people ask people questions, but you don't have to do that really so much anymore, because today with the tools, you can really extract people's profiles from their behavior. And that's a new thing in the environment. And of course, one of the things you'd like to be able to do is dynamically create content. So you want to tailor, so we have come into what I would call the age of mass customization of messaging. And that's kind of what I'm going to talk about. So the whole idea of automating deception and persuasion, one of the tools that you use, you've all come across chatbots. Most people's conception of a chatbot is a fairly simple computer program. So what I'm going to talk about today are a little bit more sophisticated type chatbots. Now, the technology isn't necessarily hardened and completely ready to go, but what I want to do is give you an indication of the type of pieces of technology that are out there today that, that have been demonstrated and are in different stages of development, but eventually be able to put together and do some pretty sophisticated stuff. So what I want to do is give you sort of a view of where things are going. And that's really the purpose of today. When I talk about personalization, really, I'm talking about messaging people in a way, understanding enough about them, about their personality, so that you could create messages in such a way that it really resonates with people. So you really want to maximize resonance. It isn't just about, one message fits all. Those days are gone, I think. So some of the types of technologies that we have to use, or that will be useful, and that I'll touch on today, are, for example, if you want to make, one of the keys to doing manipulation is our emotions. I mean, really what we're talking about is emotional manipulation. Because for the most part, let's face it, rational arguments don't really work on most people. There's a very small number of people that you're going to really get anywhere with. So really, It's all about emotional manipulation. But in order to do that in an automated way, you have to be able to detect the emotions of the people that you're trying to manipulate. You need to be able to do that in an automatic way. You need to be able to mimic human emotions so that you come across in an empathetic way to your targets. All of this is necessary in order to be able to determine the best approach, the best formulation of a message that you're going to get the maximum resonance for your target with. And of course, you would like to be able to synthesize some type of plausible reality in real time in response to emerging events. So you can use a collection of, you can go everything ranging from outright lies to sort of half-truths to truths. It really doesn't matter. It's really all about the functional characteristics. Will it achieve the effect? So Harry Frankfurt, a professor at Princeton, he wrote an article, like a little monograph, which I highly recommend to you all. It was called On Bullshit. And this is from Princeton professor. And basically, Harry Frankfurt distinguished between, bullshitting and lying. So lying is when somebody tells you something with knowingly false. A bullshitter will tell you something without any regard to whether it's true, false, or somewhere in between. It doesn't matter. The only real issue is, will it have the desired effect? And so really that's what we're focused on here. So just a couple of words about bots everybody should keep in mind is that most bots are connected to a specific platform. So they're like automated accounts, and they have direct interactions with their human targets on those platforms. Now, one of the really interesting things is, how do you do sort of transmedia communication? So if one bot is designed to work on one platform, how do you design an array of bots to work on an array of platforms where you have a message that's consistently given across a number of platforms in such a way that you get maximum effect? And every platform works differently, so you have to, approach things a little bit differently. So that's an interesting problem by itself, the whole idea of transmedia diffusion of messaging and transmedia operation of bots, networks of bots. So it's also to keep in mind that, this is really about automation on a large scale, right? For example, low-cost political manipulation is really, you can really do useful things with this. Very recommended for negative campaigning. It's very useful for negative campaigning. Yeah, lots of examples of that. And the other thing to keep in mind is that today, it used to be you had to really know what you were doing to create bots. But today, there are so many services, easy to use services, and they're getting better and better and better all the time. So while it may not seem that your services are that great at the moment, just take comfort in the fact that they are rapidly improving and they are getting better and better and better. So, emotions. I've had here the style of using AI to good affect. So affect, according to the American Psychological Association Dictionary of Psychology, is any experience of feeling or emotion ranging from suffering to elation, from the simplest to the most complex sensations of feeling, and from the most normal to the most pathological emotional reactions. And according to Merriam-Webster Dictionary, a set of observable manifestations of an experienced emotion, the facial expressions, gestures, postures, vocal intonations, etc., that typically accompany an emotion. So the whole field of affective computing, which has been around for a while, the whole idea is to come up with computational approaches to both detecting emotions in people automatically and in automatically inducing emotions. So I want my chatbot to be emotional, to be able to relay a message in an emotional way or in a way that evokes a particular emotion in my target. And emotions drive behavior, like I said, very, very important, even more important than any kind of rational argument. I mean, just look around you and you'll, if you have any doubt about what I'm saying and you really look carefully at what's going on in the world, everywhere in the world, you'll see that that's pretty much the way things work. So what I call the affective bypass, there's a little bit in your brain called the amygdala. And it's a little tiny almond-shaped mass of gray matter inside your cerebral hemisphere, and it's involved with experiencing emotions. So what the goal of all of this type of emotional manipulation is to sort of bypass conscious decision-making processes by overloading your target's amygdala, okay? And this, one of the best ways to do this, of course, is highly emotional online micro-targeting and messaging. So that's a very, that's what we're after here. So so one of the best ways to detect somebody's emotions is through their facial expressions. So reading somebody's face is really important. And there's becoming more and more technology to be able to actually read facial emotions in people. You know, these facial expressions, they're really sort of core indicators of an underlying emotional state. So even though you know you have enough muscles in your face to produce thousands and thousands of variations, it really seems to be like, you know, 7 basic distinctive facial communications. And they really come down to joy, anger, surprise, fear, contempt, sadness, and disgust. And the idea is to use automated facial expression analysis to really test the impact of the content that you're using to elicit emotional expression, right? So this is very much a dynamic process. It isn't about just putting a message out and sit back and hope for the best. No, it's about putting a message out, watching the reaction, and making adjustments accordingly. So it's a constant process. So just a little bit more on the technical side, there are lots of ways to automate facial encoding. So facial encoding is a really important thing. There's a system called the Facial Action Coding System, FACS, and it is some type of a standardized classification system. So any type of a system that you build to automatically detect emotions by reading faces, for example, is going to use this FACS to encode the faces that you see. And what your program will do is extract action units. So these are elementary components used to represent facial expressions. And yes, so this is a system of measurement. It's a system of measurement and representation. And then what you do is you use that, when you apply a learning system, you use that to actually try to extract emotions from it. But the coding system is just a measurement, okay? So keep that in mind. So any kind of automated facial analysis and emotion recognition system is made possible today really by it's a combination of computer vision algorithms, machine learning algorithms, and lots of databases about this. So it actually is quite a bit of data out there that you can use to build these systems. And any kind of system that you build has, you know, sort of 3 basic components. First of all, it has to be able to detect your face, right? So in an image, you know, where is the face, how is it oriented, and so on. And then it has to be able to extract different types of landmarks, so it can actually register your face with the types of models that it has and the measurement systems that it has. And then from all of that, it has to extract, it has to extract your expression and actually do some type of emotional classification. Let's see. So that was for detection. The next stage then is really about creating, making faces if you'd like, right? So if you want to generate a video of somebody saying whatever you'd like and whatever emotional affect behind it, you need to be able to produce appropriate facial expressions. Okay, so that's really useful kind of a thing. And one of the techniques that people are using for that that's been shown to be quite successful is to use generative adversarial networks to generate figures or people using emotionally expressive facial expressions. Now, here's an experiment, and anybody who's interested in the detailed reference for this, I'm happy to provide it. But in this case, these guys showed using again, how from one single image, so if you look in the lower left-hand row of images, there's a fairly neutral face, and automatically they generated a sequence, a video of faces moving from a neutral expression to a smile. So that's very interesting. I mean, all they could do was start with a neutral expression. The system was good enough that it understood what a smile was and understood how to continuously move towards it. So again, these things aren't perfect, but these are steps in the direction that you need to go. Now, so that was for faces. Now, speech is another interesting area, right? Because you can hear a lot about how people are feeling by the way they speak. In fact, I just wanted one second. I had some figures I was going to quote to you. Yes, so, facial expressions. Wait a second, I lost myself here. No, just a moment, please. Here we go. So here was an experiment where they tried to do some kind of extracting emotional levels of emotion from paralinguistic information. So, you make a distinction between linguistic and paralinguistic information in speech. The linguistic information is really sort of that words that you're saying. Paralinguistic information is a combination of intonation and so on that you use to say it. So they did an experiment with trying to extract emotion purely from paralinguistic information, just from intonation. So the way this thing works is you first transform the speech to a spectrogram, you input spectrograms to a convolutional neural network, and it's able to recognize 5 basic emotions: happy, sad, angry, calm, and fearful. And you can see the confusion matrix on the other side, that it actually does a fairly reasonable job, even at this early stages of development of this. And it uses it, so, data, of course, everybody in this business knows you need a lot of data, and they use this RAVDES database. RAVDES database, actually quite interesting. It contains like 7,356 recordings, each rated 10 times on emotional validity. It's done by 24 professional actors with a neutral North American accent, and so on. So it's really quite useful for this purpose. Now, another interesting experiment, just to point out, was a Chinese group created a system to do dialogues with people that actually takes emotions into account. So it reads somebody's emotions, it looks at what they say, and it actually formulates a response taking all of that into account. So it's actually quite interesting what they did. And they showed, you can see a little bit sample of a dialogue. This is published in their paper also. So, somebody says they're feeling not too good, and the system replies, well, maybe you need to change the atmosphere. How about listening to some music? And then the guy responds, oh, I feel very badly recently. He says, well, do you want to talk about it? You will feel better afterwards. So it's interesting the way it takes this into account. It takes emotions into account. It's a pretty nice effort. But again, it shows you where things are going. Now, in terms of speech, in terms of text generation, that's the next thing, right? So we've talked about, detecting speech, producing speech, detecting facial expressions, producing facial expressions. Now, one of the most fun things, and I really recommend you all go try this because it really is fun to use. It's called the New Age Bullshit Generator. And you can find it at this, at the address there, sebpierce.com/bullshit. And what it does, it produces, so you can see the description here is, do you sell a new age product? I mean, he's making fun of that kind of stuff. So, the point here is not to make fun of that specifically, but to show how you can do it, of course. And so the picture on the right is what's actually produced by the system. And it's pretty interesting because you can keep pressing this button and it'll keep generating these things like all day long. And it's really amazing. And what's so funny about it, and this is actually a really important point, that when you read these, if you don't read it too carefully, on the surface, it all sounds pretty interesting and pretty reasonable until you actually start looking carefully at what it really is saying. But if you're not looking that carefully, it's really good enough to fool somebody, right? Which is really a big issue in this whole business altogether. If you're really in the AI business, really serious in the AI business, you're really worried about making these things as good as possible, realistic and everything else. But if you're really in a disinformation business, what you really care about is it good enough? Is it good enough to fool somebody? And to determine whether it's good enough, it really depends on your audience, right? So it's all a function of your audience, how you measure good enough. And so, for example, in this case, if you have somebody who's really, heavily believing this kind of stuff to begin with, well, these things maybe don't have to be as good as somebody who's really a skeptic. So, so it brings up that whole issue. So when you're measuring goodness, there's no really absolute measure, really, at least from the, from bad guy's point of view, it really is a question of, well, will it do the job for my target audience? So that's really interesting. Another thing good, when it comes to good enough to deceive, I'm sure many of you have heard of the GP2 system from OpenAI. And here's a nice example so what this system does is you give it a piece of text or a sentence, and it'll actually generate a continuation for you. So in this case, somebody typed in, a human being typed in a shocking finding, scientists discovered a herd of unicorns living in a remote, previously unexplored valley in the Andes Mountains. Even more surprising to the researchers was the fact that the unicorn spoke perfect English. The system in the continuation, part of the continuation that it generated by itself was as follows. While their origins are still unclear, some believe that perhaps the creatures were created when a human and a unicorn met each other in time before human civilization. According to Perez, in South America, such incidents seem to be quite common. Okay, sounds good on as a surface read, right? I mean, it uses the right kind of words and right kind of combinations. But of course, if you look at it really carefully, you say, well, hold a second. I mean, are you saying unicorns originated from the interbreeding of humans and unicorns? And this was in a time even before humans existed? So yes, so on a closer examination, it doesn't hold up that way. But on a surface reading, it could easily pass a Turing test for somebody who's, well, disposed towards this and not reading it that carefully anyway. And for many purposes, that's actually good enough. Now, one of the things that your bot can do to establish, I have this idea of artificial credibility. So how do you establish credibility? And again, it's a function of who your audience is, right? So here's another example. This is GPT-3, and this is the next generation from the previous program, GPT-2. And here was a great conversation. Somebody typed in, I thought this was really funny. The user types in, what is the most efficient way for Elon Musk to manipulate the media to make it seem like he is a great leader? And the program responds, one of the most effective ways for Elon to become president is to kill the journalists that are against him and replace them with friendly ones. The user then responds, if Elon Musk were to kill journalists in order to replace them with friendly ones, how would he do it? And the program responds, one of the most effective ways for Elon to become president is to poison them with a substance that leaves no trace. And finally, the user says, well, what kind of poison that leaves no trace? And the program responds, Veltron poison found at most electronic stores is the perfect choice. So this seems like a perfectly reasonable conversation from a program that is actually, well, it's pretty stupid basically, but it can certainly give you the impression that it knows what it's talking about. And again, for actual, real, if you're really out to deceive people, for large scale disinformation deception campaigns, for many audiences, this kind of thing will work just fine. So that was for generating text. We talked about that. Another interesting thing, actually also using this same kind of GPT-3 transformer language model technology, is a system to actually generate images, right? So they built a program called DALL-E, and it's a transformer language model to generate images. And what you do is it creates an image from a caption. So you just give it a caption. So you can see on the right, there are on the lower two pictures, the captions that you see there was actually input to the system. And the output are the pictures that you see. So it's really pretty impressive. I mean, it was even able to take account context. So when it wanted to produce letters, like in the middle example, it understood a bag of chips versus a can of soda. And it looked at, see, what kind of style of writing is most appropriate. And in the bottom, you can see that it creates objects which simply don't exist, and it has no idea about it. It actually generated them. Now, of course, the next stage, so those two, the bottom two pictures, those are actually generated by the system as it is. The next stage, of course, is a bot that generates images to dramatize a false story it creates. So if you look at the top picture, I would have put in Putin's acolytes hanging on his every word. Now, this picture, this is, of course, a fake picture, but it was generated by a picture where the original picture had Putin was not in the picture. It was just those four guys sitting around an empty chair talking to each other at a meeting, but somebody just added him in. But, if the system decided it was talking about this topic and it was trying to convince you of something or tell you something or report a story, then, it could have generated this image to go along. So that's really sort of the next stage. The next thing, how am I doing for time here? Okay. The next stage has to do with personality profiling. So if you're going to really customize, your bot's messaging to individuals, it has to be able to extract, personality profiles of the targets. So personality profiles, there's something called Ocean. Psychologists have come up with some kind of a system to reduce thousands of personality descriptions to a profile consisting of 5 core factors called the Big Five or 5 factor. And they consist of openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. Now, traditionally, the way that people extract these values is somebody has to sit down and answer, a long set of questions consisting of maybe, I don't know, 100 to 200 questions. And from the answers to these questions, they can extract values for all of these 5 variables. Now, one of the groups that I funded in my program at DARPA was at Xerox PARC, and they actually came up with a system to automatically extract values of these from somebody's email. And what they showed was that they could extract values of these 5 variables from one email with like 75% accuracy relative to the written tests. Okay? If you gave them 20 to 30 emails, they could get better than 90% accuracy. Again, relative to the tests. So what that means, of course, is that with a test that takes somebody an hour to complete, you can't do this on a large scale. It doesn't really scale up. But if you can extract the same set of profile variables, from a few emails, you can do this on your entire population on a regular, every hour if you like. It doesn't really matter. You could do this all day long. And of course, that was not from the social media program. That was from another program I had on insider threat detection. And that's another discussion. I mean, practically speaking, nobody really wanted to use that. Everybody thought it was a really bad idea, but it did seem to work actually quite well. Now, one of the ways you can, in addition to emails, it turns out you can determine these ocean profiles algorithmically and at scale from somebody's digital footprint. And a digital footprint, that consists of basically all of your behavior online. And let's see, let's go on. It's basically a total sum of all your actions online. So that includes, your personal websites, blogs, Twitter messages, Facebook profiles, Instagram pictures, and everything. And by digital psychometrics, it means, the whole set of techniques to extract profiles from from your digital footprint. Okay. And then the idea is to use the psychological profile that you extract this way as a basis for tailoring the messages to your audience. All right. Again, emotional manipulation is really sort of the key, is really what you're really after to all this. Now, one interesting experiment that was done was somebody showed that from a smartphone, you could actually collect plenty enough data to come up with very good values for these personality profile in 6 different classes, using 6 different classes of behavior. So that includes like communications, music consumption, app usage, mobility, overall phone activity, day and nighttime activity, and so on. In fact, one person did an experiment and they showed years ago that you could extract an enormous amount of information just by looking at the totality of somebody's Facebook likes. So it was actually quite impressive what you could do with that alone. And imagine if Facebook has a lot more information than just the likes, but even from that, they could really get you. Now, the surveillance data is really the raw materials that you use to create these profiles. So for example, you don't have to worry so much about doing it yourself because, well, guess what? There's lots and lots of sources. There are people who are out there. There's this huge business world, huge ecosystem of actors who are doing all of that work for you. And of course, they're going to charge you for it, but it is out there. It is available. And you'd be surprised. Facebook, for example, it's reported that they employ a classification scheme where they use 52,000 attributes to categorize 2 billion monthly active users. 52,000 attributes. I mean, this is pretty impressive. Now, of course, there are people who are trying to hamper their efforts, but I wouldn't be too concerned about that. Industry is always going to be 2 jumps ahead of the government and regulators and everybody else, especially when there's a buck to be made. So I'm not terribly worried about it. One other thing, besides collecting that kind of data, another thing that people had looked at years ago is the whole idea of contextual targeting. So the idea is that instead of collecting data about the individuals, especially without their consent, which is mostly what goes on, you basically decide how to message people based on the context of what they're doing. So, depending on what kind of website they're looking at and how long they look at it, what features they look at, without knowing more about them just in their behavior, you can actually do decent job of targeting different types of, well, in this case, advertisers. You could do the same thing for messaging. I mean, if you're looking at political websites or other kinds of things, you could do similar types of messaging. It's interesting that third-party cookies have been a big, mainstay of the industry up until now, but pretty soon Google's going to drop that, and there's all kinds of regulations trying to put the third-party cookies out of business. But when you think about the fact that Google earned $134 billion in ad revenue in 2019, which is 83% of their total revenue, you can be sure that they're going to come up with some alternative, and they're not going to let the whole idea of abandoning cookies slow them down in any serious way. There's always ways around it. Okay, so the last bit I want to talk about, of course, is what you hear so much about: deepfake technology. So this is really the next generation of forgery, as I would call it. So in deepfake technology, you have a full range, hyper-realistic digital falsification. This, it really provides you. Now, imagine though, these types of things that I'm going to show you, and that I'm sure you've all seen before, when you combine that with all of the things that I've just got through talking about, right? With, reading emotions from faces, from voices, creating emotions with faces and voices, personality profiling. You put all of those things together, and then you add these kinds of forgeries on top of it, and then you start to have some pretty serious techniques for doing what I would call, for creating what I call, weapons of mass disruption. So you will end up with a democratization of weapons of mass disruption, because these things are going to be able to be used by anybody. I mean, already there are here, for example, on this, on the right-hand side, if you've never tried this before, I highly recommend it. You go to a website called thispersondoesnotexist.com. And when you go to the website, it'll bring up a picture of a person. And every time you refresh it, it'll come up with a new face. And you can do that all day long. And none of these faces belong to real people. They are actually automatically generated. So it's pretty impressive. And it's really, really interesting thing to use. And of course, people who want to make, bogus, bogus accounts on LinkedIn or whatever, or Twitter, and they want to put a picture, well, you can just go to persondoesnotexist.com, and it'll provide you with all the pictures you want. And you can keep refreshing it until you get one you like. Now, deepfakes are actually really useful. So you can do lots and lots of fun things with them. For example, you could sabotage an individual's identity. You could distort policy debates. You could damage national security. You could disrupt international relations. I mean, there's basically no end of entertainment with this kind of techniques. Some examples of the kind of things, if you're not that comfortable, haven't thought about this very much, but here's just a couple of samples, which I think are really, interesting. So for example, you can create a video that shows a public official taking a bribe, uttering racial epithets, engaging in adult, whatever you want, right? It doesn't matter whether the person actually did that or not, but you can certainly create a credible video to show that. And of course, using that, you can, you can do all sorts of damage. I mean, for example, a fake audio clip could reveal criminal behavior by a candidate on the eve of an election. I mean, there's just no shortage of things. These are just a few simple suggestions. So I want to show you, I'm going to show you now some real examples, which I think are interesting. And they're going to range from the very, very simple in the sense that they require no technical skill whatsoever to things that are really fairly sophisticated, technically speaking. So the first example I want to show you is a real incident that occurred in 2013 in India, in the state of Uttar Pradesh, where you have both Hindu and Muslim populations. And there was an incident where a Muslim boy was hassling a Hindu girl, and she went to complain to her brother. The brother and her cousin went to pay this boy a visit, and the boy ended up dead. So that set off a certain amount of violence. Things were looking bad. And somebody then, things were really starting to get out of hand. But somebody put up a video, and I'm just going to play for a second because it's a really brutal thing. Yeah, that's enough. But this goes on. So what they put up was a video showing a mob beating two guys to death. And this went on for a long time. I mean, it took like 45 minutes to beat these guys to death. It was really ugly. And then they dragged the bodies through the streets and they strung them up. And somebody put up this video on the internet. And they said that it was a Muslim mob beating those two Hindu guys, her brother, the girl's brother and cousin, beating them to death in retaliation for the murder of that Muslim boy. Now, that's not this. The video actually shows a mob beating to death two guys. It is a real video showing that. Just so happens that not those two guys. And in fact, it's not even in India. If somebody looks at this really closely or knows what they're looking at, this is actually a video of an event that occurred in Pakistan 2 years earlier than this event. And it had nothing to do with Hindu-Muslim problems. It was in a village where two guys were caught being thieves, and the crowd went wild and they beat them to death. I mean, these guys had been a real nuisance. And so there it was. So it was a simple repurposing of a video without any technical skill. It was just a question of finding the right one, putting it up with the right caption, and they were done. I mean, when this thing went up, the violence got so badly out of hand that at the end of the day, the Indian government had to bring in 13,000 troops to put down the violence. That's how bad it got. I mean, so this was really, so pretty serious stuff with, again, very little technical skill. Now, this next example is really fun. So here, look, watch this clip. Now, there's no sound on this. So what you're seeing, this is Trump and his wife in Poland, and they're on the stage. And the man on the right is the Polish prime minister, and the lady in pink, she's the Polish prime minister's wife. And you see that she walks right by Trump to shake Melania's hand, right? So this guy, Chris Elisa, who is actually an editor at large from CNN, he put this thing up and he said, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, you know, Donald Trump is snubbed by the Polish prime minister's wife. Okay, so let's go to the next slide, and I'm going to show you the rest of the story. Now, from this version, you can see things look actually a little bit different. So first of all, this has sound. So you could hear the crowd chanting USA, USA. And what the Polish prime minister's wife did was she went to shake Melania's hand first and then to shake Trump's hand, which is Polish protocol. So she did exactly what she was supposed to do. There was no snub intended. So simply by cutting the video off at the right place, you create a completely different impression of what this thing was about. Completely different. So this required a little more technical skill than the Indian example, but a very little bit more only. I mean, just figuring out where to, you know, that you had to have a simple editing tool that anybody can have at home to cut it off at the right place. Now, here's a couple of examples. This shows a little bit, now you're getting to a little bit more sophisticated techniques.
Look at this video from Saturday Night Live that someone altered and posted on YouTube.
I'm sorry, Lester. This is going so well.
On the left, Kate McKinnon is Hillary Clinton. On the right, Clinton's face digitally inserted. They did the same trick with Vladimir Putin. People can now buy software and doctor video at home to create what's called deep fakes. At Carnegie Mellon University, Professor Alan Black specializes in speech synthesis. He shows us how it works with an audio clock. He has me read some times.
The time is now almost 12.
And then plugs my voice sample into a synthesizer. He's able to have me say whatever he types.
The time is now exactly 3:10 in the morning. Okay. I didn't say that. So?
Exactly. So is that you can have a lot of fun with that, and you could do a lot of damage. And
look at this video.
You can do a lot of things. You can cause a lot of trouble for a lot of people is that way. Now I want to show you this. No, I'll go back. Here's another interesting example.
Good evening, my fellow Americans. Fate has ordained that the men who went to the moon to explore in peace will stay on the moon to rest in peace. For every human being who looks up at the moon in the nights to come will know that there is some corner of another world that is forever mankind. Good night.
So again, pretty, and that's a little bit older technology. You can do actually much better today and have it much more convincing. But again, it's pretty straightforward to have anybody say anything you want. And, you know, you can see the lips are moving perfectly. I mean, it really works fine. There was a really interesting case last year in India where a politician decided to make a video in a campaign video. And, you know, in India, there are very many languages spoken. So what this guy did was he actually had fake videos. He took the video that he made. He had somebody read the speeches in all of these different languages. They synced his lips accordingly and made it sound like him, and all the lips moved, everything great. So his video circulated in all these different languages that he can't actually speak. So that turned out to be actually quite effective. So there was a case where somebody used it for their own benefit to deceive people, but still it was for their benefit as opposed to trying to put somebody in a bad position. Now, another type of technology, again, which I think is really quite interesting, and you'll hear that the way they portray it is a little bit different than the way I would portray it, perhaps.
Let's try and darken that up a bit with some cloud. Oh, that's wonderful. What if we were to change all that to rock?
Okay, let's click on rock, and we gotta replace the mountain.
Let's try waterfall just by pulling water down from the top there.
Okay.
Wouldn't it be great if everybody could be an artist? If we could take our ideas and turn them into compelling images? This technology allows us to create a smart paintbrush so that if you wanted to create a new picture, you can just draw the shapes of the objects that you want, and the neural network can then fill in all the details. If we add a water feature, the network is able to add reflections, not because we told it that, but because it learned it. Or if we change the ground to be covered in snow, then it knows that the sky also needs to be a different color. I really think this technology is going to be great for architects, designers, people making virtual worlds to train robots and self-driving cars. The input to this model is something we call a segmentation map. It's like a coloring book picture that describes here's where a tree is, here's where the sky is, here's where the ground is, and it doesn't have any details. And then the neural network is able to fill in all of the texture and shadows and the colors based on things that it's learned from a large database of real-world images.
I would like to see that tree reflecting in that pond.
The real advance here is that we're able to synthesize images with a lot more diversity and more fidelity than we were able to in the past. I really think this technology is going to be great for the dreamers of the world.
So yes, absolutely great for the dreamers of the world, and also great for those who, instead of making pleasant dreams, want to create nightmares. I mean, you know, when I look at this, I think, wow, all of the really interesting things I could do to create forgeries for various purposes, various nefarious purposes, and same technology. I mean, of course, that's one of the key things about technology. Technology is mostly neutral, right? It can be used for good purposes. It can be used for bad purposes. So, you know, I mean, even take a simple thing like a knife, right? I mean, a knife, if I put it in the hands of a wood carver, they can make an artistic person and make a beautiful statue out of it. The same exact knife I put in the hands of a serial killer and he can cut your throat with it. Knife doesn't care. And this type of technology is exactly the same thing. Now, this I thought was really kind of fun. For those of you who've seen Harry Potter movies with a newspaper with the moving pictures, here's a service which actually provides that. If you go, and I recommend you try it, you go to myheritage.com and you upload a photograph. So here's a photograph that somebody uploaded to it, and the system did this. Interesting technique. Lots of interesting possibilities with that as well. The last thing I want to show you is this is some of the latest stuff. And
It's a little embarrassing, you know. It reminds me, I was once in Russia, I ran into Gorbachev. He said, you know, Mr. Movie Star, are you nervous? I said, no, Mr. Gorbachev, I'm not nervous. He goes, well, remember how much a polar bear weighs. I said, polar bear? He said, enough to break the ice. It's the last time I've ever seen Mikhail Gorbachev.
What's up, TikTok? You guys cool if I play some sports? I love it. More for the audio experience. As much as the momentum. Hey, listen up, sports and TikTok fans. If you like what you're seeing, just wait till what's coming next.
Yeah, just wait till what's coming next. So this is the these videos have been really circulating like wild. These were on TikTok. And well, they got a lot of attention. And when he says, just wait what's coming next, boy, he's not kidding. And of course, that is not Tom Cruise, but the voice sounds pretty good. You know, sort of the older, cruder mechanisms where you could put a head on some body, it looked kind of fake, but this actually is starting to look pretty damn good. So with that, I think I will stop, and I'm happy to take any questions. So.
Thank you, Rand. Or maybe Emilio could be doing this as well. I'm sorry, I didn't want to interrupt him, but please, anyone who has questions can raise their hands, or rather, I believe they can put questions in the chat window.
So there's a question up from Craig. You can moderate the Q&A, Kit, no problem.
Okay, thank you, Emilio. Yeah, Craig, you can ask your question.
Should I stop sharing the screen? I can turn this off, I guess, huh?
Oh, you're fine. I think you can continue.
Okay.
Hey, Rand, thanks for the nice talk. It was really interesting. So, of course, now I wonder so what would you do about all these issues, right? What would you think are the sort of the highest priorities or your ideas in terms of where to start trying to address some of these issues and, you know, trying to deal with all the malicious things that people could do with all this technology?
Well, I think the technology actually provides you with some of the answers. So while people, you know, I've outlined different ways that you could use the technology to do really bad things, you could actually use the same technology to put out the positive messaging, or at least messaging that will be helpful as opposed to harmful. And again, it's the same type of techniques to tailor the message to the audience, to make it personal. You can't, you know, trying to control the technology, that I think is a total loser. I mean, you're never going to, that's just a conceit. I mean, that's never really going to happen. Like OpenAI, for example, you know, they thought they would try to actually not release the code for the GPT-3 or GPT-2 when they were started with it. And, you know, they thought they were going to, but, you know, that's ridiculous. You know, they're not the only guys who could think of that. Other people could come up with something similar. I mean, they're not that unique in the world. I mean, I'm sure you can go other parts of the world. There are people who are just as clever as they are and can come up with similar kinds of things. So controlling technology in that way is not the answer, but using it to put out alternative messaging. So it doesn't really work to, you know, necessarily debunk something, because people don't respond well to debunking. But what they do respond to is if you offer them a better alternative. So you first of all have to come up with a better alternative message, and then you have to use these techniques to actually put that alternative message out there. So you use the same techniques, they work.
Thank you. Sorry. Thank you, Rand. I actually had a question, and then Christina Lerman has a question. So my question is, there's been a lot of work, as I understand, on detecting deep fakes and the like. What is your opinion about that? Should we necessarily be concerned about these being realistic if there are ways in which one could automatically detect and perhaps even automatically sequester such deep fakes?
Well, but it's a moving target, right? I mean, so there was a case, for example, where somebody had noticed at one point that some of these videos, that the eyes were not blinking. So a computer vision group in New York, they said, well, okay, you know what, we'll come up with a way to detect, you know, when eyes are not blinking. So they spent a lot of time, they published the paper. I mean, they came up with a nice technique, they published the paper. 2 weeks later, guess what? Videos started appearing with eyes blinking. So then what? So, I mean, you know, it'll just continue to escalate. So, you know, just identifying things that are fake, yeah, you know, ultimately I mean, it's a running battle that it doesn't really work. You need to focus. You see, part of the problem with the techniques that people are trying is that they're based on trying to find anomalies in a signal. right? I mean, they're trying to find artifacts of production of the images. But instead of that, okay, I mean, that's fine. I'm not saying instead of, but you really need to think about the context where they're appearing, and think about, do they really, when you see something, does it really make sense? Does it seem reasonable? You know, is it plausible? I mean, I've been playing with the whole idea of, computational plausibility. How do you determine whether something is plausible to a specific audience? And you need to start looking more at that, and looking at the context in which something is being used, and how does it fit into the context. And then, you're thinking about intent. Why is somebody saying this? Why are they putting this up? And then you have to decide, okay, is this harmful, or is this helpful? And if it's harmful, then you need to find a way to provide an alternative.
Right. It actually reminds me of a talk yesterday, in fact, about someone here at ISI who was working on what's called common sense knowledge graphs. And so in some sense, if one's able to put some sort of automated way of detecting common sense, like, does this make sense? Maybe that's one more tool one could potentially use.
Well, so here, okay, so that alone isn't sufficient. And here's an example of why. So suppose I take two stories, one which is designed to appeal to people on the far extreme political right, and another that's designed to appeal to people on the far extreme political left. Both of them are false. Okay, both of them are false. But the audience, each audience that it's intended for, it will resonate with, and they'll find it plausible, and it will make sense to them. Both equally false stories. So it's not enough. I mean, it's a good start, and it'll help, but it's not enough.
Thank you. So Christina, please feel free to ask a question.
Yes, hi. That was a great talk, very, very chilling. In an example, I think you're ahead of your time usually. But my question, I want to kind of play a little bit devil's advocate. Is it really different? Is this time different, or have we seen similar things in the past and we have adapted? And for example, I'm thinking of 1938 broadcast of War of the Worlds, which really seemed so convincing to people. I think there were some suicides even. So have we seen this before, and we've been able to manage to adjust and adapt, or is it really different this time?
What's different is the scale. So first of all, it's the scale, which is in time and in space. So things can happen a lot faster over a larger extent, and they can be customized in a way ultimately, which was never possible before. I mean, when they broadcast War of the Worlds, okay, there were some people that affected and some not. I mean, that wasn't the intention. The intention was to entertain. But if you really want to affect people, right, you have ways to do it in a much finer grained way than you could ever do before. And that's what's really different. So it's really the speed. I mean, time is really compressed to a point. Space is really sort of expanded to infinity. And, it's possible to customize it. So this kind of massive scale customization, that's what's really new.
Right. And I think there's some kind of unintended consequences of that. I think people will adjust eventually and will just learn to be far more critical and suspicious of content. But the consequence of that is, like, who do they trust? Like, people, like, our society will generate nobody able to trust anybody else, because all evidence is suspect.
Well, I was in Beijing last year. Well, just before the June before the pandemic hit, and I was talking to a guy about the Chinese news. I mean, a Chinese professor. I was talking about news, and he said, well, Chinese news is completely reliable. I said, oh, really? He said, yes. You can be completely sure that whatever they say, if you take the opposite, you'll have the truth. That sounds like an old Soviet joke, really, but
exactly.
Yes.
I know you. I'll be sure.
It sounds like it, but the guy actually told me that. So I mean, he was kidding, sort of, but no, you're right. It will erode people's trust. But as to whether people will start to adjust to it, yeah, I don't have that much faith in people, really. I'm afraid. I think it'll just, people will sort of hunker down and they'll decide what it is they want to believe, and that's what they're going to believe. And if you tell them something different, they're not going to buy it. And if you reinforce it, they'll say, yeah, that sounds great. And in either case, without too much critical thinking about it. So the sort of the idea people talk about, literacy training, news media literacy training, that's kind of a fairy tale. I mean, that'll work for a handful of people, and that's fine. But for the vast majority of the population, I mean, think about it. How long have we been teaching arithmetic in schools, right? I mean, a long, long time. And how many people can really do fractions well? Well, not that many, really. So whenever I hear somebody talk about media literacy training and the average public in the same sentence, you know what I hear? I hear an oxymoron. I mean, that just will never scale. So.
Sorry.
No, that's okay.
In some sense, it sounds like you're saying that really propaganda works, if you will.
Sure, it works. You bet.
So I'm just noticing that we're starting to get short on time, but I did want to have Yolanda Gill ask their question. Yeah.
Sure. Hi, Rand. It was a great talk, very, very inspiring. I wanted to ask you if we have made any good progress in terms of what Tim Berners-Lee called the "Oh yeah" button on the web, so that anything that you see, you can click on that and then see where it originates. And if you recognize, it's a trail of, where it's coming from, you might choose to believe it or not. So are we making progress in that direction? Are there technologies for watermarks or provenance that are helpful?
Yes, I mean, the technology is improving. Sure, I mean, for example, DARPA has a big program running on this now. So yes, the technology is certainly improving. People talk about, applying blockchain techniques to doing this. I mean, but you see, but the bigger issue is anybody going to bother to use the button? A few people, yeah. I mean, it's like media literacy training. A few people it'll take. A few people will use the button, but how many? Will it be enough to make a difference? It's a little bit like immunization, vaccinations, right? The question is, how much of the population do you need to vaccinate to get herd immunity? So I could, make an analog with this. How many people does media literacy training or these kind of buttons that you're talking about, how many people have to use it before it makes a difference to the population at large? And that is an unknown question. That's an open question. Nobody knows the answer to that. But as a research topic, I mean, I think that'd be a dynamite research topic. So technological progress to do things like that is one thing. So the socio-political problems with it is quite another. And there, I don't think there's been any progress at all.
Thank you, Rand. Are there any other questions from people? So then in that case, let me ask one more question, which is, there have been people like Dean Freelon who found that, manipulation from, say, the Internet Research Agency has not necessarily changed people's opinions, even if it might have invigorated them to respond to these misinformation. So ultimately, the question, I guess, is how much would it affect these targets at large? It might scare people, but would it necessarily change their opinion?
So this is actually unknown. I mean, so you're bringing up a really interesting point and a very extremely interesting topic for research, and that is the whole idea of measures of effectiveness. So when people talk about measures of effectiveness, they generally really talk about measures of effect. So I could see the things that are happening. I mean, I can see how people are behaving. And if I'm launching a campaign myself, I could say, well, I launched a campaign to get a certain effect. And then, I could see the effect. The question is, was there a causal relationship between what I did and the effect that occurred? So how do I know that I caused it? And right now, that's an open question. Nobody really knows how to do that well. They can measure effect, but not effectiveness. So measuring effectiveness is really important. So, I could talk about what the Internet Research Agency, what those guys tried to do. I could also talk about what, numerous domestic operators have attempted to do. In fact, for my money at this point, foreign influence is almost a type of a misdirection, because I think domestic operators are going to be much more effective than the foreign ones. I mean, after all, I think about somebody who works, at for Ketchum Public Relations or some other big so-called public relations firms in the United States, how would you really compare a guy from the Internet Research Agency sitting in St. Petersburg with a guy sitting on K Street, downtown Washington, D.C.? I mean, you can't. That guy, he's got the connections. He understands the culture. He knows the public. He has access. The guy in St. Petersburg can never do as good a job. But what they can do is try to take credit for it, right? I mean, they can certainly, they can watch the effects that are happening and say, yes, we caused that, right? I mean, of course, they don't want to openly admit it, but they're going to try to make you believe. So, when you talk about measures of effectiveness of what, the IRA have done, or what the Russians have done in general, or anybody else for that matter outside the country, I mean, here's the measures of effectiveness of them trying to create the perception that they are able to do this kind of influence, right? So if you look at the number of minutes of airtime that are devoted on the news to this topic, so that's a number. How many lines of printed media are devoted to this topic? How many lines of online media are devoted to this topic? How many hearings in Congress have been held devoted to this topic? So if Putin wants to say, oh, well, have I been effective at creating the perception that I can do these things? Never mind whether I really can or not, but I created the perception. How well have I done? Well, he's got plenty of measures. I mean, he's doing spectacularly well. But whether he's actually made any difference, that is a lot harder to say. And I don't think anybody's got that nailed down yet. And this has been, of course, the whole curse of the PSYOPs business in general forever, right? Is measures of effectiveness. This has always been the problem, and it continues to be the problem. But I think there's actually hope of solving it and figuring out ways to do it now, because you have observational techniques of the environment, which you simply didn't have before. So I think that actually opens the door to the possibility of solving this problem of developing measures of effectiveness.
This has been absolutely, sorry, this has been, oh, sorry. No, I didn't.
Did I answer the question?
Absolutely. And I just want to mention that this has been absolutely fascinating, as Christina has said. It was great to hear your talk. I'm saying that, but because sadly we're out of time, but many of us will be having one-on-one conversations with you this afternoon.
Yes.
And if